So we've seen some caching options. Now we're going to take a look at something that allows us to keep track of some user data from request to request so that we are able to kind of identify users and maybe even store some data, cache some things at the server based on that particular user. So one thing to keep in mind is that HTTP is connectionless and stateless. And this introduces some problems as we're trying to build applications that might have users that have information associated with them. One point is that HTTP is connectionless. This means that we don't have a connection maintained between the client and the server. A request is sent and a response is received, and that is our transaction. We don't have anything beyond that. So it's not like these connections are persisted. It's not like we can identify a user because the connection is never broken. It's very transactional. One request sent, one response received, and we're done. So it's also stateless. There's nothing built into HTTP to allow a user to be identified or associate requests with each other. So on HTTP itself, there's no way for us to identify users or for a user to say, hey, this is who I am. So we have to figure out some other way to identify users between our connections. One of those ways, and we're going to use cookies, whether we use straight cookies or we use sessions, is the cookie. So a cookie is just a small piece of data sent from the server to store in the browser. So this is kind of the opposite of request parameters. Cookies are sort of parameters from the server to the browser as opposed to from the browser to the server. So our HTTP response headers will set a cookie and use the set cookie header, and that will allow you to store some text or set some text in the browser. And the idea is that your cookie is going to have some particular key or name, and it's going to have a particular value, and it's also going to have a point where it expires. And this allows us to do something like, for example, set a username as a cookie, and that would allow the browser to then store that user's username. So we can do this in Python in our Flask application. We don't have to actually set the headers directly. We can use flask.response.setCookie and then give it a name and then some particular value. And then when we read that, we can just use flask.request.cookies.get. But again, remember this is backwards from the other HTTP parameters. So we set a cookie in the response, and we read cookies in the we read the cookies from the request. So when a browser makes a request, we actually the browser sends all of the cookies to the server. So when we're writing the response, we're setting those cookies in the browser. So cookies let us store some information, and maybe that can be just an ID. And if that ID allows us to identify a particular user, we don't necessarily have to manage cookies for every little thing. If you think about this, we could start putting a cookie in the user's browser for their username, and also like color preferences or font preferences, or maybe there's other settings in our application that we want the user to be able to manage. And if we store a cookie for each one of those, we're going to start having to keep track of all of these different names and how we use all of that data, and that's going to be very cumbersome. So sessions allow us to take to abstract all of this data from request to request, but we store that on the server, so we don't have to actually save that in the browser. So that's a nice little feature. If we think about a session, we could create some type of structure that will allow us to save data, and maybe that's simply identified by one cookie for that particular user. So sessions are typically short-lived. That might be a browsing session, which is usually those will time out if they haven't been accessed for just a few minutes. That's not something you don't need to persist that forever. Now Flask does allow you to have permanent sessions that last for a month, and sessions work pretty easily in Flask. I'll put a link to the documentation here, but you can create a session, and then you can store information in that session, and then Flask will manage the association of whoever is accessing the site and allow you to store some property and value, key value pairs in that session, so that now you can kind of use this as a cache, and you don't have to look up data every single time the user wants to do anything. So that makes it allows you to make applications that have a little bit higher performance. Now, this does introduce a challenge in App Engine, because remember, we're going to start off with App Engine's servers just having a single instance, but as we get bigger and bigger, we might have to have more and more application, or more and more VMs, more and more instances. So we might cache something in one of these, but then your next request goes to a different instance, so then it has to rebuild that cache again. And if we have many servers, let's say we have a dozen servers, we could end up in a situation where we go to 1 and we have to cache something in the session, and then we go to 2 and then we have to cache something in the session, then we go to, it keeps sending us to different servers. So each one of these caches is now going to be duplicating data, and we can't necessarily guarantee which one of these instances is going to serve our request. Now we will identify some ways to solve that problem later in the term, but for now you can kind of rely on sessions because most of these applications are going to be small, and if we have the need to rebuild a cache a second time, it's not necessarily going to be that big of a problem. It's only when we get into many servers where this particular shared memory problem becomes an issue. So for now, cookies and sessions will probably meet your needs as you're developing your first applications. And like I said, you can take a look at the documentation for Flask sessions and sort of explore that a little bit on your own. Thank you for watching.